Good afternoon, college football fans. Dan Ring, College Football Ring Zone. Thanks for joining me today for week 2 of our podcast, talking about all things college football. Appreciate you guys working with me and watching last week and listening to me talk about week 1 games and moving on to week 2, getting through the glitches that we did. And I think we're making progress there. So it's going to get better every week. And there's so much to talk about almost every day with what's going on in not only college football, but college athletics in general. So it's an exciting time to be a college football fan. And I thank you all for joining me. Feel free to chat. Send me any questions you have, anything you want to talk about, any other topics that you want to discuss. Would be greatly appreciated. Shout out, as always, to Tony and Dan. Dan's producing the show for me again, my mentor, and certainly could not do this without him. And we're looking forward to great things at Heat Ratio Sports. And everybody, make sure you tune into Dan's podcast, Flyer and Ice, as well. The hockey season starting up in about a month. I think training camp starts in the next week or so. Make sure you all tune into that. So, kick off the show today. I want to just kind of review what happened last week in college football. Big news was the Ohio State loss to Oregon. And I don't know anyone that had picked Oregon to win that game. They were missing their 2 best defensive players. A third got hurt during the game. But Ohio State just can't stop anybody. And that was kind of the problem. And I mentioned it last week. Ryan Day does a good job, but they lost a lot of players, and they're going to struggle. They play some high-powered offenses in the Big Ten, and that's going to be interesting to see how they bounce back this week. I think they will. Still think they'll maybe lose one more game before Michigan. But Michigan, who we'll talk about a little later in the show, is a team that I think is on the rise, and maybe Jim Harbaugh's found something there. So that's something that I think has to be watched as well, just to see how OSU bounces back. And Oregon's bounced into the top 4 of the college football playoff on most people's boards. They have a long way to go, but what's going on out west is bodes well for Oregon since they won their non-conference game, because that's a really, really weak conference, Pac-12. Other big game last week that I wanted to bring up, which was really interesting, was Arkansas, Texas. Texas going to be moving into the SEC, and Arkansas gave them a preview of that by just beating them up, physically beat them up. Texas is not ready to play high-level football right now. It's going to take Sark some time to get the recruits he needs, get them to play hard, and get them to understand that this is big boy football. There's a lot of weak sisters in the Big 12, not in the SEC. So every game in the SEC they're going to play is going to be a battle. And Arkansas, watching that game, they just manhandled them on both sides of the ball. That game was 40-21. It wasn't even that close. So Texas, I'll be surprised if Texas is relevant at all for the rest of this season. They have a lot of problems down there. Not all Sark's fault. It's going to take him some time. They just don't have the players to compete with the big boys right now. And Arkansas is not a great team. They're a mid-level SEC team or a lower-tier SEC team. They have been for a long time. But they just beat Texas up. So shout out to Arkansas. That was a really impressive win. But I'm not sure how good Texas is. So we'll know at the end of the year how much weight that carries. A couple other teams I wanted to touch on that we talked about last week that I said to look out for, games I wanted to spotlight. Rutgers. So I told everybody Rutgers is for real. Greg Schiano has them playing hard. They have some athletes. And they went on the road and beat Syracuse. Syracuse is, not a great team. But Rutgers defense flies around to the ball. And they can really run. And that's the most important thing. To compete in the Big Ten, you have to have athletes who can run. You have to be physical up front, obviously, and have athletes in the secondary. And Rutgers has that. And they're going to get better, and they're a team on the rise. Rutgers is not an easy out for any team this year in the Big Ten. So that was an interesting game. I also mentioned Miami, and I said I was not that impressed with Miami getting steamrolled by Alabama. They should have lost to Appalachian State. That's not a great Appalachian State team. I think Miami probably had some hangover from Alabama, but they did all they could to hang on that game. I think they're going to get better. Manny Diaz is a really good coach. He's going to recruit the hell out of South Florida, but they're not quite there yet. So scare for Miami. We'll see how they do the rest of the year. They have Clemson in the ACC, and North Carolina I think is overrated, as we saw early on. So Miami's a chance to go to a good bowl game this year. But they're still a year away, I think, from making some serious noise. If they hit the top 15 the rest of the year, I'll be surprised. And the last team that we talked about last week, which is where we're going to kind of lead off the in-depth portion of this program, is USC. And I mentioned last week they're going to have trouble with Stanford. It wouldn't have surprised me if Stanford beat them, and Stanford beat them and got Clay Helton fired. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit because USC is a blue blood program. And Clay Helton's been there for 6 or 7 years, and hasn't really done that much. They went to the Rose Bowl in 2016 and made a little noise in 2018. But other than that, really nothing. And Slovis, I think, is overrated. I think he's a good quarterback. He's not a great quarterback. And I think Clay Helton is a nice guy. And USC administration gave him a long leash. They wanted to see him succeed, and they were rooting for him. It just didn't happen. But I was shocked that they would fire him in the middle of the season after the second game of the year. I know you lost to Stanford. You didn't look good doing it. But what changed from 6 months ago to losing to Stanford that all of a sudden you fire Clay Helton? Unless something else happened that we don't know about yet, which will come out. But I was really surprised that they let him go, and that's set off a firestorm of speculation since Sunday night when people saw how Jacksonville Jaguars played, and Urban Meyer's at the top of a pretty long list to replace Clay Helton. USC paid Clay Helton $10 million when they fired him. USC has money to burn. The money is not the issue. It sounds like a lot of money to us, and it is. But to USC, it's really not. If they have to go buy out a coach, which I'll get to in a minute, they'll do that and pay a coach's buyout to their university. But Urban Meyer doesn't need to worry about that. I think Urban Meyer is a college coach. He's a very good college coach. So I think that that will be an interesting play over the next few weeks to see how that happens with the USC job. So I see the question about Florida State almost beating Notre Dame and then losing to Jacksonville State, and I'll touch on that in a second when we talk about finalize the review of last week's games. But I just want to keep on this Clay Helton thing because I think it's a blue blood program that there's been so much talk about with the tradition at USC, and to fire a coach in the middle of the season for losing to Stanford, it was a pretty well-respected program. And David Shaw is one of the most, if not one of the top 5 most respected coaches in college football. He's been there a long time. And Stanford has their up years and they have their not-so-great years. They always compete, and they always seem to get players. So losing to Stanford is not the issue. It's the way they lost and the expectations at USC. And Urban Meyer seems to be the perfect guy. I think he's realizing that the pro game is a lot different than college. You don't have the control over the pro players that you have over college kids. And it would not surprise me at all if Urban Meyer doesn't last the season in Jacksonville and winds up at USC. There's been talk about James Franklin. I don't think that's going to happen. As you can tell, I'm the Penn State guy. That's what I grew up on. Touch on James Franklin a little bit more a little later when we preview the weekly games coming up. But I don't see him leaving Penn State. It's his dream job. He can use it as leverage to maybe get more money. He's getting $5.5 million now. They just put a ton of money into upgrades. They're redoing Beaver Stadium over the next 5 years. They have they're in the top 10 of facilities now as far as their weight room, their training center at Penn State. So I don't see James Franklin. He's got a $4 million buyout with Penn State also. He's got to pay them, which USC would pay. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think they're going to focus on Urban Meyer, maybe Bob Stoops, where USC wouldn't have to pay a ton of money for a buyout. Bob Stoops has no connections to anybody. He's been retired for a while now. So those are the two names to watch. And we'll see how they do the rest of the year. They'll have an interim coach, and we'll see how USC does. But if they go 500 this year, I'll be surprised. So I just don't see it happening with USC. I think that's going to take a longer time than people think. Even if Urban Meyer goes there, it's going to take a couple of years. So to address the Florida State issue, Florida State's kind of irrelevant now. It was a great game against Notre Dame. I don't care that they lost to Jacksonville State. They weren't even – I mean, I don't know what kind of defense they were playing. Shouldn't have been close. You know, you're talking about a game that they scheduled 7 years ago. Jacksonville State got about $750,000 to $1 million to go down and get their butts beat by Florida State. And they shocked them because Florida State was not very good. They played above their heads against an overrated Notre Dame team. And so Notre Dame also didn't look that great this week. But we'll see what happens with Notre Dame. But Florida State Mackenzie Milton is a great story. I love them at Central Florida. I love him now. I think he's a great quarterback. But they don't have anybody around him. They don't have playmakers. And they took Jacksonville State for granted, obviously. And they just looked like they were not interested in playing. And then I don't know if you saw after the game, they had one of the players, as Jacksonville State celebrating, one of the players at Florida State proposed to his girlfriend after the game. So that's the mental aspect of it. I don't think is there for Florida State. I don't know if Norvell's the right coach for that team, for that school. I don't know if he has the right mentality. I don't know. I'm just not sure about that. So we'll see how it shakes out. I don't know. Florida State to me right now is not a relevant college football program, and not somebody that people are really watching unless you're diehard Florida State fans. They're not going to make any noise, and it's a shame. I wish it was different. I wish Florida State was on top again. You know, Bobby Bowden had them in the top 5 for 15 years in a row, which is pretty incredible. From the late 80s, early 90s into the early 2000s, they finished in the top 5 in the AP poll 15 years in a row. That is unimaginable in today's college game to do, unless you're Alabama. You know, Alabama and Clemson have had great runs. Everybody has a down year. But to do what he did back then in those days, well, you didn't necessarily have scholarship limits, which makes it a lot harder. But still, to do that when Miami was really good and Florida was always really good, and they played a hard schedule every year, and they had great games with Miami, and they lost to Miami a couple times, you know, on wide right. To do that was special. They just don't have it anymore. And I think they're trying to get that back, but I just don't see it happening anytime soon for Florida State. So with that said, I want to talk a little bit about my upset pick from last week, which was Nebraska-Buffalo. I thought Buffalo would beat them. It was 14-3 late in the third or early in the fourth quarter. And I was watching that game. I couldn't watch it anymore. It was very difficult to watch Nebraska right now. They're just not good. They're not a good team. Buffalo's average. They play hard. You know, they're in a obviously group of 5 team. They could have won that game. Yeah, Nebraska's got Oklahoma this week, which will be really interesting to see. If Nebraska covers, I'll be shocked. I think it's 31. I think it's the line, maybe 22. I'm not sure. It might be 22. I don't see any way Nebraska covers that line. I think Scott Frost is gone. I think the players have tuned him out. It doesn't seem to me like they play hard for him. And I said this last week, there's a disconnect there between Scott Frost and his players and what's going on in Nebraska. There is no reason they should not compete for the Big Ten West every year against Wisconsin and Iowa. And they should be in that conversation. And the fact that they're not, I think, just tells me that Scott Frost is not the right guy for that team, for that school. for whatever reason, everybody thought when he went there he was the perfect guy. You're struggling against mid to low major college football teams still, and he's in year 6 or 7 at this point. It's just I don't know. I don't have the answer for Nebraska right now. I just think they need to start over again and try to get back to the way they were before, where they just have huge offensive lines and they just try to pound the ball and get a quarterback. Like Martinez is a good runner. He's not a great passer, and nobody's going to be dazzled by his arm. That may be the way they come back and kind of mold themselves after Wisconsin. That's what I think they have to do to compete, because they're not going to get the skill players to compete in the top echelon of the Big Ten right now with Scott Frost there. So with that being said, just added a little new segment, MIT, as I was thinking about MIT today up in Boston, as I was doing some mathematical equations. So for this show, MIT is going to be the most impressive team of the week, which to me is Michigan. And Arkansas is a close second. But Michigan, to me, Washington might not be very good, but they were ranked early in the season. And they're always respected. Washington usually plays hard. Michigan ran all over them. And I am not going to make excuses for Jim Harbaugh. When he's bad, he's bad, and he can't beat Ohio State. This year's probably his best chance to do that. They've been impressive so far, and they were really impressive. That game was 31-10. It could have been a lot worse. They ran all over Washington. They ran for over 250 yards that game. And McNamara is a good quarterback. He manages the game. He makes plays, and their defense was really flying around. They showed as much emotion as I've seen a Michigan team show in the last 3-4 years. They're going to move up in the rankings, and they have a relatively easy couple weeks coming up, I believe. I don't know what their schedule is, but I don't think they hit the meaty part of their schedule until late October. So they were really impressive to me. Arkansas, we touched on before, they were really impressive, and they're going to make some noise, but they're going to run up against Georgia and Alabama and Texas A&M and other schools that they're going to have to play. And the SEC is just a buzzsaw. But Arkansas right now is physical. And as I said, they were impressive in beating a Texas team that might be a little bit overrated. But anytime you go in and do what they did to Texas, it's impressive. But Michigan was the most impressive team I saw this past weekend of the major college games. So let's talk a little bit about coming up this week. 2 big games. First is Alabama, Florida. People have talked about that since last year. And Florida last year had, they lost Kyle Pitts and Trask and Tony to the NFL. They don't have those players. They just don't have the players to compete with Alabama. Quarterback situation is kind of murky right now. They don't really know which way to go. And I just don't think they have the players on defense either to handle Alabama, who's just really impressive. So that line is, I believe, 14. Wouldn't surprise me if that was a 40-10 game, 40-14 game, something like that. I don't think Alabama will have too much trouble covering that spread. I think it'll be close for a half. After that, I see Alabama pulling away. They're just too deep for Florida. So I don't really think that's going to be that close of a game getting into the fourth quarter. I think Alabama's going to kind of cruise. But the big game this week for me, and I think for most of college football fans, is Penn State Auburn, which has been circled on the calendar for both teams for a long time. And it's going to be a whiteout. Happy Valley was great last week with 107,000 showing up for Ball State. And the whiteouts up there at night against big schools like Auburn, they've played at Ohio State, Michigan, are an incredible sight. And I saw a couple other podcasts, guys were talking about whiteout, and it's overrated, and it doesn't really matter that much, and it doesn't make that much of a difference to the visiting team. It absolutely makes a difference. It absolutely makes a difference, and that's what makes college football great. 107,000 passionate fans with tradition, with you see a completely white stadium. You have the noise level. You have the band playing. You have everything pumped up. You have your school pumped up, and you're coming into that stadium. It absolutely makes a difference. And I've seen it. Graduated from Penn State and knew a lot of the guys who played up there in the late 80s, early 90s, even up to some of the more recent guys. And the players who play say it absolutely makes a difference. And the opponents have said that too. I've talked to some of the opposing players too. It absolutely makes a difference. Will it be in the difference this game? I don't know. I don't know that much. Auburn hasn't shown us that much so far. They've only been, they played Mercer and they played Alabama State. I'm sorry, they played Alabama played Mercer. Whatever, they had 2 easy games. They played Akron, 60-10, and they won 62-0. So you can't tell. They've had 2 scrimmages so far. Bigsby's a really good running back. They have a good line. They lost a ton of their receiving core, so they're pretty new. Bo Nix has been there for like 15 years already, it seems like, and he's a good quarterback. Came in with a lot of hype. I don't know if he's a difference maker. He tries to manage the game, but he seems to make crucial mistakes at bad times. And this Penn State defense is really good. Their secondary is really good. They're athletic, and they've been pointing towards this game for 2 years now. So it's going to be a hyped up crowd. Most people or most publications or pundits that I've watched have picked Penn State to win. It's a small line, 4.5, 5, probably go up to 5 or 5.5 maybe before the game. I think Penn State's going to cover. My tendency and my problem for years has been like they just make crucial mistakes at the worst possible times. They play a great game and one mistake and they lose. And that seems to happen in the James Franklin era too many times. Wisconsin showed that they can play tough teams in a tough environment on the road, and they might be finally mentally tough enough to compete and play and win big games, whether it's at home or on the road. And we'll see. As I said, I don't know how good Auburn really is. This could be a 20-point game. It could be a 3-point game. I can't envision a situation where unless Penn State completely implodes, they're not going to be in this game. I can see a situation where Auburn has 2 or 3 turnovers in the first half, and it's a 21-point game at halftime, and Penn State's up 24-3. I can see that, and they can ride momentum, and win this game rather easily. It's going to be an interesting contrast whenever the SEC and the Big Ten play each other. It's going to be fun. It's going to be a great atmosphere, as I said, night game, and it's one that's going to shape whether Penn State's going to move into the top 8 in the country. If Auburn wins, they'll be in the top 15 or maybe even higher, and then they get into the meat of their SEC schedule. So I like Penn State to win. I just think that Wisconsin game, they can kind of springboard into having a great season. And another great thing about college football is the emotions that are involved with college kids 18 to 23 years old. And I saw it last year with Penn State when they lost to Indiana in overtime. And you saw what happened. They went 0-5. That game, Indiana beat them 3 weeks in a row. I mean, they weren't prepared. They just kept thinking about that loss and how things would have changed. Had they won that game, maybe they go 7-2 last year instead of 4-5. This year they come out, they beat Wisconsin. That could lead them to a 10-2 season or 11-1 season. They still have Ohio State and Iowa on the road. They still have Michigan, as I said, a much improved Michigan team at home. Michigan State looks much better. Rutgers is not going to be easy. Maryland beat them last year pretty handily, and they play Maryland at Maryland this year. Maryland can score points. So there are no easy games. They have a breather after Auburn. They have Villanova, but then they have Indiana, Iowa on the road, and Maryland, I believe, after that, and then Ohio State on Halloween. So this is a must-win game if they want to have a really successful season for Penn State. For Auburn, I think they want to come up and prove something because they haven't yet, and they haven't had the opportunity. Not their fault. So we'll see how it plays out. I like Penn State to win, and I think they're going to win rather comfortably, something like 30-17 or 31-17. I think they'll cover. So that's all the games I wanted to preview. we'll talk about at the end of the show. A couple other games just want to mention coming up. But now I want to move into our sideline segue, and we're going to be profiling Paul Chryst. Okay, I want to focus on Paul Chryst this week, the Wisconsin coach. I have a ton of respect for him. I'm going to be really interested to see how Wisconsin plays the rest of the year. They outplayed Penn State the first game of the year. Turnovers lost the game for Wisconsin. I don't know how much Penn State actually won it, more of Wisconsin losing that game. And they play the same kind of way every year. And Paul Chryst goes back. He's got roots. He coached the Chargers. He played at Wisconsin, been around the college game for a long, long time. He was the head coach at Pitt and went 19-19 before he took the job at Wisconsin, and he's been really successful there. His winning percentage is above, I think it's about 68%, 70%. Wins games he should win. Doesn't really beat themselves other than that Penn State game. I'd like to see him win a Big Ten championship. They're getting there. They got beat by Penn State. They got beat by Ohio State. He's a good, solid coach. He's a good man. Players love playing for him. They play hard for him. And he's one of the most respected coaches. And I mentioned David Shaw earlier. Paul Chryst is kind of the Big Ten's most respected coach, I believe, at this stage, but hasn't really won anything yet. So I'd like to see him kind of take that next step. And he's been able to be successful with the Wisconsin blueprint of great running back or two, huge offensive line. Receivers are adequate. Quarterback is adequate. Graham Mertz was a pretty high recruit. I don't see him taking the next step. I don't think he's that kind of quarterback. He's not going to go out and win games for you. The defense is always good, and their defense is really impressive. Their linebackers are spectacular every year. They just have great athletes come in and play linebacker. Secondary is up and down. The D-line is usually pretty stout as well. I just like to see them recruit some high-level receivers and a top 5 quarterback, whether he's a pocket passer and can just throw the ball over the field and has a cannon for an arm, and they kind of will spread you out instead of just trying to pound every year kind of the same blueprint. Maybe they'll have some different results. Maybe they'll finally get over the hump if they try that. Look, what they've been doing is working for what it's worth. And that's the blueprint of Wisconsin. And Paul Chryst is a Wisconsin guy, and he's adopted that style. He pretty much did the same thing when he coached Pitt, and he was a 500 coach at Pitt, which is a completely different situation. But he's in for the long haul there, and I have a ton of respect for him. I just like to try to see if maybe he tweaks things and does things a little bit differently. I'd like to see them take the next step and be able to beat the big three in the East in a championship game in Indianapolis, because I like their program and I like everything he's done and what he stands for. He just seems like a really, really solid coach and a good guy and a highly respected guy, and does things the right way. And is not afraid to suspend players if they do something wrong. But I like to see him maybe just tweak things a little bit. I really like to see them get a great quarterback. They just seem to have kind of middling quarterbacks that come there. And Jack Cohen he was a good quarterback. He's at Notre Dame now. I'd kind of like to see them just get like a Trevor Lawrence kind of guy, and just see how they kind of rebuild the offense around him instead of building it around the running game. And they always have great tight ends as well. They're always going to have great offensive line and a big offensive line. But just kind of 1 or 2 years, maybe just moving things towards more of a spread at times. I'd like to see how they would react. But Paul Chryst is a coach that I think is a credit to college football, and comes from a great background, great coaching background, been doing it for a long time, and just a guy that I've respected. Stands up, takes the heat when he has to, doesn't pass blame, will absolutely tell it like it is. He did that in week 1 against Penn State. He's done that in the Big Ten championship games. He's done that in games that whether he's won or lost, he's a straight shooter. I just have a ton of respect for him. So want to just kind of highlight Paul Chryst and hope that he continues to have success in the Big Ten. So with that said, I want to move on to our Heisman Hype segment. And we're going to focus a little bit on Breece Hall, the Iowa State running back, who was a favorite to win the Heisman before the season based on what he did last year. He was an All-American. He's kind of fallen off the radar, and Iowa State is right now in line for my most disappointing team because they didn't come to play against Iowa. I mean, you're home, college game days there, get everything going for you. You haven't beat Iowa in like this century, and you come out and Iowa's beat, Iowa turned you over a couple times. Hall fumbled. Purdy got benched. It just showed they weren't ready for prime time, which was a disappointment. I thought they were. But Matt Campbell's a really, really good coach. They were a doormat for a long, long time, and they're not now. They were ranked higher than Iowa going into that game. And they just didn't show up for some reason. Iowa just kind of took the will out of Iowa State, most of the game going into the middle to the end of the third quarter. It was 27-10. So there's Hall. He's a big kid. He's about 225 pounds. He's going to be a good pro player. But right now he's averaging about 70 yards per game. Had a key fumble. He's got a couple touchdowns. But, Iowa State, I think, will have opportunities to come back. And last year they came on really strong at the end of the season. They'll have to do the same thing again. Purdy is a good quarterback. He can take the heat off Breece Hall. But if Purdy is mentally gone, Hall's going to have a lot of trouble opening up holes or running through holes. And he just didn't have a lot of space against Iowa. Iowa's a top 5 defense. I understand that. But I don't know. Breece Hall, there's a lot he's got to do to get back into the Heisman conversation. There's a lot of players that have passed him. But, it's still early. We'll see how it plays out. To win the Heisman Trophy, I think you have to be one of the best players on one of the best teams or just have an unbelievably spectacular year, that's so much better than anybody else statistically that they have to give it to you. And it's going to be a tough hill to climb for him to get back into that race. So Breece Hall kind of reminds me just a little bit of our flashback Heisman winner today on a profile, which is the Tyler Rose Earl Campbell. So Earl Campbell in the late 70s when he won the Heisman, which was So Earl Campbell was so fun to watch. And I was 7, 8 years old, and I remember watching him with the tearaway jerseys and the wishbone they ran in Texas. He was an absolute beast. He was Herschel Walker before Herschel was. And there was one GM who said that Earl Campbell was the only player he ever saw who could go from high school to the pros and be a star as a running back, which back in the late 70s, early 80s was really saying something. He was an absolute monster and fast. He was huge. His legs were like tree trunks. And he was not only a great college player and won the Heisman, but he was a great pro running back too, and injuries cut his career short. And he's had some health problems recently. He's in his mid to late 60s, still living down in Texas. But he was just so much fun to watch, and he was a very humble, quiet guy. And I just always remember the tearaway jerseys that they had. I used to love that. down in the Southwest Conference that they would play out Arkansas and Oklahoma from the Big Eight, but they would just play Baylor, and those were just fun games. And he was absolutely dominant. So I just wanted to kind of remember for a second some of those clips, and if you have a chance to look at some other clips of Earl Campbell. He got hurt his junior year. He only played 7 games, but his freshman, sophomore, and senior seasons were tremendous. And he was very worthy of the Heisman. He was the number 1 overall pick by the Houston Oilers, played 6 years with the Oilers, and then finished his career with New Orleans, and was just a really, really great ambassador for football. Never got in trouble off the field. Just unfortunately, his running style led him to getting a lot of injuries, led him to getting hurt a lot, especially later in his career where he just couldn't run anymore. But when he was healthy, man, there was nobody better, faster, stronger, and more powerful than Earl Campbell. So wanted to remember him for a second as we do a Heisman flashback. And next week we'll have another coach that we'll spotlight, and we'll do another Heisman hype segment with another flashback. And we might even stick with that late 70s running back theme. So we'll see if we can do that next week. So with that said, I want to finish up with 3 games I want to look at briefly for this week, and just give a little commentary on the state of college football as well. So the 3 games I mentioned, this one a little bit earlier, Oklahoma, Nebraska. It's actually 22. I think Oklahoma is going to crush Nebraska. We used to be a great rivalry, still a rivalry in some ways, but Oklahoma's dominated this series over the past 5, 6, 7 years, and Nebraska I just don't think is ready for this kind of game yet. So I expect Oklahoma to win that one big. Kind of an interesting one, and I'm doing this one for my producer, for Dan. Virginia Tech, West Virginia. West Virginia is actually favored. Virginia Tech's ranked 15th in the country. West Virginia's unranked. I believe it's a home game for West Virginia. It's probably why they're favored. They get at least 3 points for that. They're favored by 2. Not really crazy about Virginia Tech. I'm not sure what to expect from them. They've been wildly inconsistent. And I thought they'd be a little bit more consistent at this point under Fuentes, but it hasn't really happened yet. So I like West Virginia to win that game. It's going to be a close game, but I think West Virginia is going to pull that one out at home with the crazy crowd in Morgantown. So I'd like to see them like to see Virginia Tech do well. As I said, Fuentes is a good coach, but I think West Virginia is going to beat them in that one. And then the Alabama-Florida game, it's 15. As I mentioned earlier, I think early on it'll be close. I think it could be a close game at halftime, but I think in the second half, Alabama's going to run away with it. And they'll win that game pretty easily by at least 3 touchdowns. And we talked about Bryce Young last week, and he's just a really, really impressive player. And I don't think Florida has anybody on defense that can handle him, and I don't think Florida has anybody on offense that's really going to be the kind of game breaker they're going to need to get really big plays against that Alabama defense, which is one of the best defenses they've ever had, which is saying something. You think about the players they lose. I'm not going to go on the Alabama rant again like last week, why I think Saban's so great and that program is so impressive and just tremendous year after year. But this defense they have this year, from everything I've seen and read and heard, could be the best one they've had in the past 15 years, which is really scary for everybody else. So I don't expect Florida to be able to score nearly enough to keep up with Alabama in that game. So my upset pick this week is going to be Tulane over Ole Miss. Ole Miss is good. Corral's a good player. I'm impressed with him. I didn't know that much about him before the season, and I like him. There's something about Tulane. I don't think that Oklahoma game was a fluke. They came back. They showed a lot of guts. They lost to Oklahoma by 5. I think they can beat Ole Miss. It's a southern kind of little rivalry game between Mississippi and Louisiana. And Tulane, I think, is a little underrated. I think Ole Miss might look past them. So I look for Tulane to beat Ole Miss this week. It would not surprise me at all. And I think that's a pretty I feel pretty confident in saying I really like Tulane. It's a 14-point spread, which doesn't really mean that much to me. I think Tulane certainly would. It's going to be a close game either way. But I think Tulane's going to win that game outright. So I like that as my upset pick this week. So with that being said, there's a lot to go over this week. There still is a lot to talk about. I look forward every week to bringing some new conversation to the board and to college football podcasts all over the place and college football fans all over the place. Special shout out again to Tony and Dan. Make sure you subscribe to YouTube, Heat Ratio Sports, and Flyer and Ice podcast, which will be starting up very shortly as the season starts. Dan Old School Green has some really great guests, and he's going to have a really positive show this year as long as the Flyers do well, which hopefully they will. They made a lot of good changes, so we'll see what happens. But make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel, and Heat Ratio Sports has a lot of great programming. We'll hopefully be doing some more new shows and maybe even some more live shows with some more content in the near future as well. So special thanks to those guys. Last thing I want to say this week is a little bit more on the state of college athletics from a legal perspective. We talked a little bit about the NIL, which name, image, likeness. And I think EA Sports is coming out with college football again. And they're going to give a percentage of that to the players. I think they're going to have to do it as like put everything into a pot and divide it up amongst all the players. But more and more players are getting their own deals now. And I think it's a good thing. I kind of changed my opinion on that. So now that the legal issue has been settled, there will still continue to be more and more money made by really good college players and college players that are average, because you're in college towns, whether it's students, whether it's faculty, whether it's alumni, they follow college athletics and college football in particular. So, if the players can make a little bit more money, why not? There's so much money to be made in college football that there's plenty of money to go around for the players too. Besides the scholarship money that they get and the meal plans and everything else, I think it's a good start to kind of come up with a restructured NCAA on the compensation issue. I personally hate the NCAA. I think Mark Emmert is a creep. I think he's sleazy. I think he's out for himself. And if he ever watched this, I would love for him to come on and talk about that. I have not seen him do one good thing in the past 5 years for college athletics, except where it's only where he's concerned. He could care less about the players. I'm glad the NCAA got clobbered in court, and I think he needs to be replaced. He's there forever. I think the commissioners like him because he's kind of their puppet, and I get that. And he works for the commissioners of all the different leagues and the college presidents. But I think he's a stooge, and he should be replaced. And maybe this NIL ruling is a first step towards doing that, putting in somebody in there who has sense and can write rules and regulations for college sports that make sense for the players and the schools. So with that statement, let's see what happens. Probably not going to happen anytime soon, but we can hope. And maybe one of the new commissioners in one of the larger conferences can step up and will be the new president of the NCAA at some point, and get some sense made out of what the rules are, because they're so archaic and they're so antiquated at this point. They need to be completely redone. But there's so much money involved, I doubt that that's going to happen anytime soon, as I said. So we'll see. So everybody have a great week. Enjoy another great weekend of college football. And I will see you next week for episode 3 of College Football Ring Zone.